So, if you've ever purchased something from a sales-led organization, you know that there's usually a lot of traction and momentum built up before you're making the purchase, but then, you make the purchase and things tend to die off a lot after you've done that. So, Stuart, I would be really, because you're from Arrows, you guys know a little bit of stuff about onboardings. So, I would be really curious from your experience to hear why you think it's so difficult for companies to kind of build and have an onboarding journey that really kind of keeps that momentum that you have in the sales process, and you're not just feeling abandoned as a consumer.
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely something that we see a ton is that that momentum that you've built up and been really rigorous about maintaining throughout the sales process. You have all sorts of tactics during that process to maintain momentum, make sure that you're getting to a close. And then often there just isn't the same focus on what happens next, right? Deal moves to closed one, and it's a simple question, what happens next? But often the answer is, well, we're not entirely sure. It goes to a different team, and there's no clear expectations set with a customer about what's going to happen. There's no clear expectations set internally about what's going to happen. And ultimately, what we see is that there ends up being a gap in the sort of silos between teams, right? There's the sales team, which has been really focused on closing the deal, and then maybe there's an onboarding or implementation team who is responsible for turning that closed one deal into a successful activated account. But often there's a gap in the middle, and everybody ends up playing catch up to the frustration of the customer who is left with this thing that they just paid a lot of money for, that they're really excited about trying to use to solve their problem, which brought them to you in the first place. And they end up stuck in this limbo of not being exactly sure what to do. And ultimately, that sort of lack of cross functional or lack of cross team and cross sort of stages of the buyer journey uh, collaboration results in this gap that you can only really solve by bridging the gap, right? Like your teams have to talk to each other. You have to build a process that doesn't end at closed one. And what's something that we see a lot in terms of and suggests a lot in terms of helping build momentum beyond closed one is just move things that are later in the journey that are the sticking points today where your team is asking, you know, what is the customer's goal? What system do they need to integrate? Move all of those questions that come up that are blocking progress and move them earlier so that you're both setting expectations at the very minimum. This is the information that you're going to need to provide. These are the people, or this is the person that you're going to be working with in order to share that information and have them go do their piece of the work to get up and going. But ideally, you're actually moving the actions earlier as well, right? Are there things that, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but are there things that are sort of showstoppers for somebody being successful with your product? How do you address those as early as possible? Make sure that you're not selling somebody who is almost guaranteed to churn because they'll just never make it over that hurdle. So I think that's the biggest thing is being or identifying that where are the gaps, where are the silos that you've created intentionally, unintentionally, and what is the impact of that experience for the customer? And then how do you move the things that you're going to need later in the process earlier so that they're not a surprise to anybody and don't completely grind everything to a halt?
What do you think there about because yeah, like it's the kind of how to do it, but I guess as well is like there's a lot of investment in the kind of
Mhm.
like when you talk about the typical kind of revenue engine, it's always in terms of like sales, like hire more sales reps and like do more activities there, but it's never really about how can we, optimize for retention. I mean, I know it's a metric that's been a lot in focus recently, but it feels like there's also a lot of that kind of just it's an afterthought and people and companies don't really want to pay for it. So like looking from Arrow's perspective, like what would be the kind of really big kind of triggers that you see a lot where someone is like, okay, enough is enough. We actually got to do something about this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, often you see it, if you have folks who are getting to the renewal and you can't even contact them uh, because they've already checked out from your product, moved on to using something else, right? They're sort of long gone, and you only find out about it at the point of renewal. Typically, that's when everybody worries about churn and starts to try to solve their churn problem, is when people have either churned or that you're trying to negotiate a renewal with them and they're just not interested in doing that. Usually, the problem is significantly earlier in the customer journey than that, right? So we often say retention starts on day one and really it starts on day zero. Like the very first interaction with your customer, you're setting some kind of expectation with them, right? You're making an impression, you are um, giving them sort of a perception of what they should expect, how things will go, the outcomes that they should be able to expect, and the work and sort of investment on their part that will be required to get to those outcomes. And I think that that is the best place to start is sort of come pull all the way back. Like, where in the journey are we starting to see a mismatch in what we're expecting to happen and what we're saying and what the customer is expecting to happen and ultimately what they're actually doing, right? We often see that customers who engage early, and this is where onboarding and the handoff process from sales to onboarding and implementation specifically becomes really important. Customers who engage early drastically outperform customers who don't, and some data that we can share from Craig Danes on this. But um, the key thing there is you have to engage customers quickly because the moment where they are most excited, most invested, have set aside or are thinking about setting aside resources to make your adopting your product or changing behavior in their own company around this purchase. The time when they're doing that is right at the start, right? They've just gone through the sales process. They've been sort of laying out, thinking about how they're going to actually go from uh, buying a product to seeing value from that product. And if you don't meet them where they are and give them a clear path to where they want to go or where they're trying to go, it becomes very, very easy for customers to drop off. They have a million other things on their to-do list. And as much as we would love to think that our product is the most important thing in their universe, it's just not, right? And unless you can both identify what they're trying to do so that you're actually matching what they're expecting and what they're hoping to get out for it. And not every customer is going to have expectations which align with what you can actually do for them, and that's okay. It's very good to know. Like you should be totally okay with some level of churn that is just from bad fit or poor fit customers. But for the most part, you want to be identifying what people are trying to achieve and making sure that the path that you are giving them helps that actually aligns with that, right? Um, because far too often we see either there's no path at all, which is pretty common, right? There's like no documented path from uh, okay, you bought this thing, how do I actually get to be successful with this thing? Um, and even if there is, it's often not presented in a way that matches what the customer is expecting or aligns with the way the customer is having to make changes internally in their organization to adopt something. And I know the question here was about churn, but all these things ultimately, anytime a customer is falling off that path from I bought a thing to I'm trying to use it to bridge the gap from where I am now to the outcome that I want, anytime that they're falling off of that, they become a churn risk, right? And I think that uh, being able to identify those moments where they're not on that path both requires having a path, but also being rigorous about checking in, making sure that you're uh, aligned, that they're not only is what they're saying aligned to um, to that path and to the goals that you think they're trying to reach, but also that their behavior aligns to that, right? And I think uh, especially today, the CFO has become a much larger stakeholder in a lot of deals, both on the sales side, a lot of deals, but certainly in a lot of renewals, right? Everybody's looking to cut costs and really make sure that they're getting value and ROI from the things that they're paying for. And it's very easy for somebody who isn't in the day-to-day work using a tool, trying to do the work to come in and say, oh, well, like we pay for this thing, but we don't use it, or we're paying for 50 seats, but only two people seem to have signed in. What's that gap? So I think being proactive about those kinds of things um, is really the critical piece because otherwise you're going to end up in the situation where come renewal, you're trying to play catch up and fight fires and you've probably already lost, or you probably lost the renewal way earlier than actually the date on their contract.
I mean, it becomes transactional again because like every time we want something from the customer, that's the only time we engage. So when we want money from them for them to buy, we talk to them. When we want them to renew because we want more money from them, we talk to them. But anything in between is like it's kind of an afterthought. And I
Right.
customers notice that. Like I very much know when like you buy something and then you don't hear anything and you don't even know how like who to contact, what to do. Like it really destroys that kind of trust that the company really built up during the sales process, especially if it is like a more kind of big tool. Of course, there are so small tools you just we get started in 5 seconds and it's all good.
Yeah.
But a lot of those kind of enterprise and bigger tools, like it is, you actually need a little bit of hand holding or some forms or guidance. And as you said, you really need that when you are in the mindset of, okay, we just bought it, let's get started. I got the budget, the team knows about it, and I don't want to look like an idiot. So please help and make sure that I don't do that and that we can actually start using the tool ASAP.
Yeah, and I think that that's a big piece there too. Is even, you know, I don't think the level of, touch or human attention it necessarily correlates to you're an enterprise company and you're buying sort of enterprise software that requires a physical or a human implementation. I think that the bigger point is that uh, making sure that or acknowledging that adopting anything new requires changing from something old, right? And that change management, that process of changing behavior, of rolling out to a team, of getting adoption across a broader team, um, is just not something that happens overnight and is not something that happens by putting in a credit card and signing up for a software product, right? There is often a lot of whether it's process change, whether it's human behavior change, whatever it might be, there is a lot of there is a lot happening around the action of buying a new product, and being really clear about and having a plan for how does that happen doesn't necessarily have to mean, well, we're going to get on a bunch of calls and we're going to walk through everything step by step live on a call. Maybe it means having better enablement resources for the team lead who has just bought this thing for their team to understand and help them roll it out so their team actually sees the benefit of the thing, right? Like often you'll see that, and sort of I guess the opposite side of the coin, or another, the other side of the coin, from internal silos between the sales team and the onboarding implementation success team. But there's also sort of quote unquote buying silos, right? There's the executive team, which maybe has one set of goals for buying a tool. There's the management level that has a separate set of goals for buying something new. And then there's actually the daily users, uh, potentially under all of that, who have a very different set of not necessarily goals, but requirements for the product. And I think making sure that you're uh, acknowledging and trying to like creating a path that enables all of them to be successful is ultimately important if you want to see uh, those great business impacts when it comes to renewal and expansion time, because people are actually getting value from the thing that you sold them.
Hmm. So if you would kind of we talked there about the kind of yeah, like the renewal part, like the kind of you make the purchase, you have like the renewal, and then there's a lot of things happening in between. So what would be the kind of high level milestones if you would kind of start by designing that kind of post sale journey with specific milestones, and we kind of start with setting those up, and then we can go more into details in terms of okay, what do we do in each of those kind of stages? Like what would be the kind of key milestones that you would kind of think that everyone should start monitoring and measure?
I think a lot about dependencies in
Mm.
this process. Like somebody buying your product is likely the first dependency to them getting value and being successful with your product, right? Like unless you have a an extended free uh, trial, but if you have a free plan, like potentially that's different. But for most B2B products, paying is going to be, if not the earliest, an early milestone there. But then after that, we look at sort of go live, launch, whatever you want to call it, whatever the first sort of set of things that they need to do in order to be in a position to actually start using the thing for real, right? What are the dependencies there? What are the features that they absolutely have to use? What are the who are the people who they absolutely need to get to engage and do work in order to get to the point where we can actually use this for real in a way that returns business value for us, right? And that'll look different for everybody. That might be a limited pilot. It might be a broader rollout. It might be a single user on a team using it. But what is the sort of first or the earliest moment that you can determine where somebody is in a position to use the product enough to start getting value? And we often talk about time to value or time to value often gets thrown around as a metric for onboarding and implementation. And I think it's actually really hard to measure. And the problem when you have something that is really really hard to measure consistently, but also repeatably across different customer types, across different customers even, you end up with something that is very, very hard to report on and feel confident that you are reporting something that you can actually go take action on, right? The ideal reporting that you have lets you identify gaps, lets you find opportunities, lets you identify when things are a little out of the baseline and go, do something about it and take action. So I think that is where something like time to launch, which can be very objective, it can be, sure, you can certainly have multiple, time to launch metrics across different customer segments to match their behavior, their needs in terms of reaching that kind of milestone. But it becomes much more objective, and you can actually create a defined process to get people to that point. I mentioned earlier, it's one of the big things that we see, and one of the, Arrows, the collaborative onboarding product, is certainly built around this idea that implementations work much better as paths, not projects,
Paths?
because paths, as in like the company being able to define like these are the things that you need to do in order to be successful, rather than a project which is sort of more flexible and unscoped and custom, which there's sort of generalizations of the
Yeah.
terms, but the distinction there being, as a company, if we are selling good fit customers who we have case studies for, who we have successful customers in who meet those sort of criteria, we should know and be pretty confident that we know this is the way that we make them successful. Right? I think where companies run into challenges a lot, which you start to see in onboarding and you really see further down the journey in the business metrics, is when you start to sell to drastically different customers and you end up finding that they all have totally different needs, which causes, a lot of, you end up with custom development, you end up with custom cut, like all these sort of very custom things. And it becomes really hard to scale and sort of operationalize how you make them successful, because you end up doing something entirely different for everyone, which causes all sorts of resource challenges, and there's all sorts of downstream effects of that. But once this is the metric that these are the criteria for somebody being ready to launch, ready to receive value, you can start to build the path that is going to predictably get them there, and then you can optimize against that, right? So I think that's the first thing, is like, what are the dependencies, the criteria that somebody needs to sort of check off in order to get to the place where they can start seeing value. And again, like, knowing what is the business value to your customer is incredibly important, because you want to be able to frame everything in that light, right? We are going to go down this path. We are going to launch. Like, our goal is to get to a place where we can launch, because we want you to be able to realize this business value, which is specific to your business. But the steps that we're going to take are actually going to be pretty similar, if not the same, across businesses. And then I think from there, once you've got to the point of like, okay, we actually are in a place to start realizing value, then you have to look at adoption, and how much. The one that I like is sort of a consumption metric, which I guess is more obvious depending on, it can be more obvious than other times depending on your pricing model, depending on the specific product. But essentially, how much of the thing that somebody bought are they actually using, right? So that might be in a seat-based model, it's very obvious, right? Like, I paid for 30 seats, but actually there's only 2 users who have ever been active in a product. Like, that is a problem. If you are selling, some businesses have entirely usage-based pricing, right? Like, those are the ones where it becomes very obvious in onboarding and sort of time to launch and being in a position to start using the product becomes exceptionally critical to the business. Like if you only get paid when somebody processes transactions through your product, for example, um, the volume of transactions there is sort of going to be your consumption metric, right? Um, but that's sort of the next one that I would look at, because it is generally a good way to see where are we on the spectrum of, okay, we know they're in a position to start using this for real. Are they actually using it for real, right? Or at least they might be using it for real in a very limited way, and maybe that's okay, but acknowledge that when it comes to renewal conversations or financial conversations or more business impact focused conversations, there might need to be some tempering of expectations there, right? Like if you were expecting this to improve team efficiency by X%, and two users on the team are using it like have improved their efficiency, but nobody else has, there might be a delta between expected outcome and real outcome. But that's one that I think can apply across a lot of businesses and is a good. It's sort of an ongoing metric too, right? You can see the trend of consumption, um, and helps to sort of identify pretty early, assuming that you've got them to the point of they're actually in a place to start consuming and using the product for real. I think that's the next one that I would look at.
Mm.
Um, and I think that beyond that, I think that that's sort of an ongoing one. But I think beyond that, like you have to take into account like what is the I won't say yeah, I guess sentiment to a certain degree, but like not in a CSAT or MPS type way, but more so in a, okay, these are the outcomes that almost like a an outcomes being solved sort of measure, right? Like those are things that aren't going to be captured in your product data. You're going to have to go have conversations with the people who are buying, are setting the goals on your customer side, and just ask the question, right? Like how how many of the goals, or how of the goals that you set out when you purchased, how have they been reached? Have they not been reached? Are you making progress towards those goals? And I think that is ultimately the question that a lot of people like to ask, which I think you can ask early too, is, if your renewal was today, would you renew? Right. And I think those two things sort of go together, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't necessarily have to hit the goals already that they set, but you have to be showing meaningful progress. They have to see the path from where they are now to the outcome that they want.
So I really like the thing you mentioned there with the dependencies and that kind of mapping out like what needs to happen first, making sure that is checked up before you can kind of continue. And within that as well, I guess like thinking about what is the stuff that takes a lot of time, and the kind of the slowest walker concept. So what is the kind of thing that is going to be blocking it down the line? Let's make sure that we give them that homework early, so they can actually start working on that dependency that you potentially with time will just gonna uncover that, well, this is actually causing a lot of issues. So I really like that, the kind of dependency thinking. How would you how would you kind of work with that? Because we talked a little bit about, I said, you have a person that can call you and have calls, but then you also mentioned that, well, of course that doesn't have to be the case. Like you can have, online resources, videos, wikis, whatever it might be. How would you kind of balance all that? And I know that the errors, you have a lot of forms and, you're giving homework to the customer. Like how does all that work, especially like in that kind of first go live phase?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. I think something that is core to how we think about designing and we call it an onboarding plan at Arrows, because that's sort of the way the product is oriented. But really, it is your onboarding process, right? Like, what is the process that you're going to use to move somebody from I purchased this to I'm ready to go live, be successful with this. And the dependencies really comes down to, and often we see this when folks come. We mentioned any adopting anything new requires changing something old, most likely. Sometimes folks will come to us and they will have a documented plan. It'll be in a spreadsheet or a document or whatever it is. And often, and some of this is because of how the Arrows product is sort of built in an opinionated way around some of these things, but often those plans are much, much longer, and much less ready to be customer facing, than maybe is ideal for the Arrows product. But ultimately, I think there's something to that in general when you're designing an onboarding or implementation process. And back to the idea of dependencies is, what do we actually have to do now in order for this customer to be successful, to move to the next sort of phase, to reach that next milestone? And the question that we like to ask whenever we are working with somebody new, or whenever you're designing a process like this, is, okay, list out everything that you do today, or everything that you think you need to do today if it's not already defined. And then for each item on the list, go through and ask yourself, what happens if we don't do this? And not just what happens if we don't do this, but what happens if we don't do this today, or now, or before this next milestone, right? And if the answer is nothing, which in a lot of cases it is, right, just remove it or push it later push it out of this milestone into a future milestone. We see this a lot with folks who, have sold, customers have been sold the dream, they've been sold all the advanced features, this amazing functionality in the product, and then it all gets slammed into onboarding and implementation. And actually, it's not the thing, it's either not the thing that is important to the customer reaching their initial goals, um, but often there are dependencies before those advanced features that unless you satisfy those, you'll never be able to get there. A great example of this is reporting features, right? Everybody loves to tout their fancy dashboards and their advanced reporting, but an obvious dependency for reporting is having data in the system, right? So those are really the tasks that we need to be prioritizing, or the actions we need to be prioritizing early in the journey are, where's that data going to come from? Is it going to be a migration? Is it going to be created new? Is it going to be integrated? And then who is going to do that work, right? And I think this is a big thing that trips up a lot of more, not necessarily complex onboardings overall, but at least onboarding and implementations that have complex tasks in them, is that nobody asks the question of who can actually do this task. Right? You see this a lot fairly often in software products that are, somewhat technical products, but the target audience is not technical, right? Like Segment, for example, is a good example of this. A lot of folks use it for marketing data, but you do need to implement it in your product. You do need to implement some code, and they do a great job of asking, if this isn't A, they try to identify the personas when you sign up, but B, they ask you, are you not the person to do this, right? Like, do you need to send this to a developer? Here's how you send it to a developer. And they have enablement resources, they have documentation. And I think that's the thing that often gets missed is, and it's not just exclusive to technical tasks, there are other reasons why you might need to loop other people into the process. They might have access to different things, or they need to approve certain things. But being really intentional about, okay, if this is a task that has to be done now, who is going to do it? And then make sure that we set expectations around that we loop that person in, and then set clear expectations for that person. Okay, when do we need it done? Why are we doing this thing? What are the implications? What are the risks that they need to be aware of, to make sure that task, which probably isn't that much work. I mean, maybe it is, but usually the thing that delays progress isn't so much the work itself. It's not knowing what the work is, not knowing when the work is expected to be completed. Lag between customer says, "What do I do?" Getting a response 2 days later, an email, like you lost 2 days in your process, right? So I think that all of those things sort of come back to the dependencies idea. Like, how do you make sure that you're only including things now that have to be done now, and then being really intentional about who is going to do those things, and often what order are you going to ask people to do those things in? Like, are there things that you can work in parallel on because it's different people? Are there things that, once I mean, the reporting example is good because it sort of satisfies this, but, are there things that if we get the data in now, when we go to the executive presentation later, we will be able to show live data and help validate parts of the process? Like, are there things like that can be incorporated just by being more intentional about what tasks we're asking people to do when? And these tasks could be, in a plan like Arrows, which you're sharing in a more one-to-one relationship, or they could be things that are in the product. They could be things that you're sharing in email. But the important thing is to be intentional about why you're including everything that you're asking customers to do.
Yeah, no, I really like the starting with a big list and then removing And I'm also firm, like more and more so, a firm believer in the kind of getting back to basics and really focus on. But I also agree with your point there that it's not what you get told in the sales process, and it's not, probably not even what you find exciting yourself. So I'm not sure if it's a good idea to have a little bit of sprinkles, some of the cool stuff early, just to kind of keep the excitement up. For like with the CRM, for example, like a lot of companies, especially if they're kind of in earlier stages, they would buy HubSpot, for example, as a CRM, and then you ask them like, "What is your sales process?" And they say, "Well, I don't really have one. What do you think?" Okay, so what kind of information is important for you? And they're like, "Well, yeah, we're not really sure. Like, how do you send out, invoices and stuff like that? Like, PDF." And so it's like, so in that case, right, like they should really focus on the basics. Like, well, let's have a super boring sales process. Let's define the steps and let's do all that boring stuff first, which is not really, it's actually super important and it is really the essentials. But I guess a lot of companies, they don't find it exciting. And we see that a lot. That is kind of yeah, but we don't really want to do that. Well, we want to have the cool forecasting and all the cool reports though.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that's where knowing why people buy is so important, right? Because you want to be able to tie everything back to, well, you said in the sales process you were trying to solve this problem. Is that still the biggest problem? Because this path that we're working on together, and we're in this together, like I think being able to put yourself on the same side as the customer is important, right? Like how do you say, you told us about this goal, we're going to get that together. Here's the path that is sort of most or will best fit that goal. If that's not still the goal, well, then we can change the path. But if that is the goal, then these are the steps. And I think a lot of that is sort of trying to make sure that you're trying to maintain accountability for the customer, right? Like it's all very well that they are going to get excited about these advanced features, but if the reality is they'll never actually be able to use them unless they do all this stuff, you're sort of doing yourself a disservice by letting them go spend time or helping them go spend time for something that actually, when it comes to the renewal, people don't renew on flashy features, right? Like they're going to renew on, did I see impact? Did I get the value that I expected from buying this thing? Um, doesn't mean you can't talk about the flashy, exciting things, but framing it in their goals, I think makes that conversation a lot easier and also helps ground it in, okay, but this is actually the work that we need to do today in order to get you to that great place where you have fancy forecasting.
yeah, and see that a lot as well, that a lot of the time they're super happy with, like, they never even get there and they're like, well, this is
Hmm.
plenty good enough, it's actually really good so far, so all the fancy stuff we actually realize we don't really even need it yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, I exactly agree with you there as well, like to focus on the goal and focus on the problem. We're trying to solve this problem for you, and then you have all these things we need to tick off first, and focusing on that instead of the features usually makes that conversation a lot easier. So going back a little bit, because we spoke before as well, like with the kind of milestones, and we talked a little bit about metrics and also those kind of soft touches as well. So not just relying on, but actually having a person or someone contacting the customer again. Like, how would you think about balancing those two? Because metrics are nice, but you might not get all the information. But I feel like a lot of companies, they default to just having the metrics and they never really actually speak with the customer about their experience. You mentioned that kind of form with would you renew if it were today? But yeah, balance there would be interesting to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to measure, and I think we're certainly at Arrows would have tried to design the product and try to, uh, as we're talking to folks about their onboarding process and about how they're designing their sort of post-sale motion, generally there is less sort of focus on the metrics, I think, or it's less common that somebody comes in and is like, look, here's my dashboard, here's everything that, like, if you go to any sales rep, they know their quota, they know what they offered the month. There's just less focus, I think, on the metric side post sale. So being in a position where you have those metrics, you're using your metrics, sort of you're establishing a baseline and you're experimenting against that baseline, making changes against that baseline to try to improve it, I think is one side. But ultimately, the sort of balance on metrics versus human touch always comes back to, uh, are the metrics that we're trying to optimize, are they purely our business metrics, or are they things that the customer actually cares about, right? And I think that's the trap that people fall into too often, is that they optimize things that are purely about their business. They're things like, how much is the customer using the product? What is the, NPS score that they gave us? How many times have we engaged, like how many touches have we had? And they might be helpful, they might be in some ways they're sort of directionally accurate, or proxies to what's actually going on. But ultimately, are you having an impact on the customer's business becomes the most important thing. And you can't find that out. I mean, sure, you can ask them in product, like you can ask them directly about that, what's happening there. Um, but having a conversation, actually doing some discovery, sort of ongoing, continuous discovery, becomes really important to make sure that you're aligning, you know, what we're trying to ask customers to do, the path that we're trying to guide customers on, with where they're actually trying to get to. I think that's the all too often it's easy for those paths to diverge, and you end up with, well, the company's just pushing all their new features, and they are, they're leaning into AI, so they're pushing it, like customers to use more AI, like whatever it is, like they're pushing the company agenda, and the customers over here just like, well, I needed more efficiency for my team, uh, to improve this one process that they're working on, but it's not on the roadmap. Like I think it's very easy to start seeing those things, and that's maybe an extreme case, but like it's very easy for the customers' expectations and the company's expectations to diverge, and it's really hard to, as we talked about earlier, it's really hard to bring those two things back together when it comes time to renew, when it comes time to have a conversation about the thing that you need the customers to do to help your business.
Hmm. So think about tying things together, like the feedback loop there, like internal feedback loops, because I mean, this goes for, I think marketing, sales, you have it's so rare for companies even to do like win-loss analysis, for example. They would just say, well, okay, it's closed. Let's not worry about it again. And same with marketing, handing over to sales. There's like few companies have a good feedback loop there. And I would imagine it's very similar with the onboarding as well. It's like, well, we do the onboarding, but we don't really have some kind of a feedback loop going back to sales, and also to optimize the onboarding itself. Like, how do you guys at the errors? Like, how do you guys do this? Because I guess you do it, and maybe you have some clever strategies there or tips.
Yeah, so we certainly do it a lot, and it's where it's smaller, so it's easier in some regards. We also like use our own product and use HubSpot pretty deeply. So having things connected, I think that's the first thing, is how much visibility, how much connection actually is there between different stages of the journey, right? And this is, we're obviously bullish on HubSpot as a tool to make this much easier, because and bringing all of your teams across the customer journey into one tool, because you don't have to worry about so much integration between different parts of the journey. Because I think that's pretty common, is that you have, you know, marketing teams over here in HubSpot, Salesforce is maybe, sales team is maybe in HubSpot or Salesforce, and then you have this customer success team and some other, like a customer success platform, and you sort of end up just spread, and it becomes a huge project to bring all that data together, get everybody on the same page.
It would be so nice as a rep to know, as a sales rep, like a household, I had no clue the onboarding status. Like this was a long time ago, but just being able to know that and see, hey,
Yeah,
the onboarding actually completed. I'd be like, oh, awesome. I'm just going to give them a
yeah,
ping and see how it went, and then build it. So, sorry for interrupting, but I was just like, I would really have liked to have that, because I never knew.
yeah,
And sometimes the customer was like, hey, we haven't heard anything for 2 weeks. What's up? And you're like, oh, I thought you were done. No,
yeah.
no one
Well,
has contacted us.
and this is obviously, shameless plug here, I guess, but Arrow's the
That's
product,
okay.
is the sort of customer facing collaboration layer on
Yeah.
top of what your internal teams are working on in HubSpot. And what that means, though, when it comes to the sort of cross-functional collaboration piece, is that, sales can have their own pipeline, onboarding and implementation can have their own pipeline, whether that's tickets, deals, whatever. But the plan that you're putting in front of the customer stays constant. They just have one plan, and you can just move it between objects. You can uh, always see the status of what's happening. And the way that we use that to sort of build that bridge between the sales process and onboarding implementation is that sales actually introduces onboarding pre-close, right? We have an onboarding plan for the customer. We show it to them on sales calls, so they know these are the steps, right? There's no mystery here. Like, these are the steps, this is the investment, this is the work that you're going to have to do if you want to be successful with the product, right? Um, and then from there, sales, actually the first step in the onboarding plan is the last step in the sales process. So we have pay for arrows is the first task in their onboarding plan, which then unlocks, okay, now you can go book a kickoff call with your onboarding manager and like move forward and make progress. And which does two things, right? It helps set the expectation that you know, in order to unlock everything that we've just talked about, you have to make your payment, you have to do the work. It gives the sales rep visibility into you know, what progress, because they can still see that plan, they're on the plan, they can still see have visibility into the progress, and they don't have to go to arrows to do that. They see all the everything syncs back and is accessible from inside of HubSpot. So that part's easy. But then from an onboarding perspective, it really helps build momentum, because we can, you know, as soon as the customer's paid, they go right onto that next task of booking a kickoff call. And before the kickoff call happens, and this is something that I think as you get better at documenting and defining your process, you sort of unlock is, okay, now we can have the customer do some prep work for that kickoff call before they get to the kickoff call. So when we get there, we've already completed, you know, 3, 4, 5 tasks in their plan. They're building momentum. Sales sees that they're off to a good start. And there's no mystery about who's responsible for what, when the work is expected to be completed. So I think whether you're using arrows or not, being able to have that continuity between the sales process and visibility between the sales process and what happens next is key. And we don't do this. We have a Slack integration, a Slack channel where you know, you see as customers reach onboarding milestones, it pings that channel. But you could certainly do that if you're just using HubSpot, for example. Like if you're using HubSpot pipeline for your onboarding, you could ping sales when a customer completes onboarding, right? You can update their status in your CRM when they complete onboarding. And I think that is, so I think that those are sort of the two pieces that are critical, is making sure that the experience isn't actually siloed from a tools perspective, and the data isn't siloed from a tools perspective, but then you are sort of providing that feedback loop, reinforcing the loop between teams, both as mentioned, sort of with notifications and, you know, status updates, but also like, do you have a cadence around checking in and updating the process? Like I'd certainly recommend probably once a quarter, something like that. Put time on the calendar with people from both teams, right? Like, okay, what were the metrics this month? What happened? What didn't go as well as we expected? What felt off baseline? Was there a particular type of customer that was being sold who didn't onboard very well? Was there a particular type of customer who was being sold who does onboard very well? Are there anomalies in here? Are there specific reps? Are there specific, you know, business verticals that run into a specific challenge? How do we address those earlier? So I think there's lots of things that you can do, and building more of a process, more of a continuous process around, you know, iterating on your process is important.
No, yeah, I think and yeah, like having that view and that kind of feedback loop and giving that stat, I think that's again, like I'm sure a lot of things generally have happened, you know, since I was trying to sell HubSpot back in the days, but like that kind of feedback loop and those kind of milestones, and I guess you like, would you also have some kind of a like health score, I guess, in hours? Like you would just like after the onboarding, like 1 to 5, happy camper, not happy at all, bad fit, bad sales rep.
Yeah, I
Would you
mean,
do something like that?
we don't have the bad sales rep option, but we
Nah, like I'm just
certainly
talking rubbish here.
certainly ask at the end of onboarding, you know, sentiment,
Mm,
and importantly, you're trying to improve the, like, yes, you just got this customer through, they ran with one version of your process. You want the next customer, the next version of your process to be better, right? So asking, is there anything that wasn't clear, right? Is there anything that would have improved this experience is helpful, not because you want to go put it on a dashboard somewhere, but because you want to go update the doc, you want to change the task, you want to like move things around, reorder things. And not that you should necessarily just do that because one customer said so, but over time you start to see patterns. You start to identify both in the data and sort of more qualitatively where are the bottlenecks in the process.
yeah. No, great. I think that, like we could probably keep on talking here forever. So to avoid this being like a 2 hour show, keep it in the hour. Is there anything you think we missed, by the way, like in terms of the onboarding kind of arrows, insights, and tips? Like, is there anything that you really wanted to kind of share that you think would add a ton of value, or did we cover the?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I mean, I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that um, for folks listening who are thinking about improving their onboarding process, I would definitely go through that sort of dependencies exercise, list everything out, and then essentially edit your list to what's important now, right? Like what happens if we don't do this now? Use that as sort of the framing um, for that. And I think beyond that is, trying to unify the experience for the customer and set better expectations across that experience is always going to help you further down the road, right? It's easy to punt on onboarding and sort of making customers successful post sale, but you really pay for it later when it comes to renewals, and it's just significantly harder uh, to win somebody back than it is to onboard them right in the first place.
yeah, great. No, and yeah, and I really like that kind of, as you said there, with as we talked about today, like starting with key milestones, look at the dependencies, what needs to happen in each stage, focus on the simple stuff first, the basics, the unsexy things that you really should be doing. Focus on that first. Know who should be doing what, and don't be afraid to give homework to the customer as well with a date. And I would say there as well what we talked about in the beginning also, that if this is important to someone, and like if this is a tool that is solving a real problem, they want to spend some time on it. They want to actually get something done. And if you don't give them homework, especially early, I believe that you're missing a big opportunity to get a ton of momentum while they're excited about it. Because after a month, it's like, are we not done yet? I don't want to do more tasks now. So I think it's getting a lot of that stuff done early on. And as you said, they're giving that homework before the kickoff and during the first sessions. Like, I think it's so important.
Yeah, and I think that's where like the length of time that it actually will take to complete the tasks is going to vary depending on your process or on your product. But I think that's where being really sort of ruthless about how you edit your tasks becomes really important, because maybe you do still need 100 tasks to ultimately onboard everyone, but I'd bet there is almost always a subset of those tasks that you could do first and get them to a milestone that feels good to them, that feels like they're making progress towards their goals. Because ultimately, I think that's where you have to sort of continuously validate and verify that this was a good purchase, right? And the best way to do that is through action, um, that they're actually making progress to the thing that they expected out of this work. If you're sitting in implementation and you haven't seen anything, you haven't gone live for a year, for 6 months, like it's very easy to like you end up in this tough spot where it's like, well, we have a lot of sunk cost here. Do we keep going? But also, are we ever going to get there? So I think being able to really uh, edit ruthlessly and find the sort of incremental milestones where the customer can see, oh yeah, this actually is lining up with what we're expecting. This actually looks like if we continue going here, I can see we do some work, we get some momentum. We do some work, we make progress towards our goals. Um, I certainly anytime that you can do that is I certainly suggest it.
Awesome. So, final question for me, Stuart, here today. Repeat question, a little bit more philosophical. So, like, what's kind of one insight or learning that has really changed the way you kind of see and approach life and or business?
I mean, I think the thing that I always come back to is sort of people before metrics, um, customers before metrics, however you want to sort of put that. I think obviously metrics are important, but I think that ultimately solving for the people will have the impact that you want on the metric. It's it can be hard and can be sort of not necessarily line up with short-term goals in a business, but I think that the impact of solving for the people is much larger than optimizing for the metric, right? If you really solve somebody's problem, you build trust, you build sort of resonance with what you're doing, which ultimately has a sort of much better compounding effect than just winning a customer today. It's really a good sort of it lines up very well with onboarding type stuff, right? It's much easier to optimize for the customer actually being successful and you see the impact on expansion and retention rather than okay, we're just going to win that revenue today, and chances are we, you know, maybe they just don't renew, but you can also burn people pretty easily, right? If it becomes very obvious very quickly when you're not invested in solving their problem and actually making them successful. Um, so I think generally that's sort of be helpful, be value first on a lot of things is generally a good approach to things.
No, I love it, and I definitely agree. Like just focusing on metrics, like you will never be able to design your KPIs and metrics so good so there's no negative behavior coming out of it. Like no matter what you do, like if you're not also looking at what's more than this, what is the kind of person behind everything and using good judgment and having all those things in place, I think you're gonna have a tough time in general. Maybe someone can pull it off, but I've not seen any case where a metric could not be I'm not gonna say tampered with, but it's always encouraging behavior in some shape or form, and that can be
Yeah,
really powerful, but it's not always great.
yeah, totally.
Uh, cool, Stuart. Where can people go to find out more about you? I know you're a big shot at LinkedIn. That's your jam, right?
Yeah, pretty active. So I have more stuff coming on LinkedIn soon. But yeah, connect with me there. Shoot me a message. Let me know if this was helpful. If you have any follow-up questions or anything, always love chatting with folks. And then, of course, if you're interested in improving your onboarding process, specifically for teams using HubSpot, arrows.to is the place to check out. There's a product there. We also have a huge library of sort of really tactical templates for implementing this kind of stuff in HubSpot, and and building an onboarding process that scales. So go check that out, arrows.to. But yeah, any questions? Always happy to chat with folks.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Stuart. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me on.